What if a client pops up on a dating app? The idea, this usually gets this reaction. The idea of social media and personal relationships with clients may seem obvious, like you may have you know the answer to this question, right? But besides hitting the red X, you would be surprised what people do. So this is the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers discipline committee decisions, and if you take 30 minutes, if you have 30 minutes, do a quick perusal. Every time I go and look, the vast majority of the first few cases I look at have some technology, social media, communication component. So this is one of the first examples I clicked on when I went looking last year for my class. So this is actually from the decision. Since becoming a registered member of the college and while providing counseling services to their client, the member engaged in a series of boundary crossing violations, which included engaging in telephone conversations, texts, and emails with the client during and outside of normal business hours, as often as 2 or 3 times a day and on weekends. So this then now is the member's response. If the member were to testify, he would state that the client's needs and requests for services were communicated by the client to be urgent situations, and that it was the client who repeatedly texted and called him at unscheduled times requesting counseling. So whatever else is going on here, and this is a much bigger, this is one snippet, clearly, again, that boundaries in digital communication is not being established or maintained. So this is undoubtedly, the example I just showed you was an extreme example. And again, I'm not telling you that you can't be on social media, that you can't be on Tinder, that you can't be on a dating app, right? What I'm saying is that it's not just how you respond in the moment by obviously clicking the red X, right? But it's also how you unpack that with a client. Because if you saw them, they saw you. Right? And this is not true of just dating apps, all other kinds of social media situations. They might pop up as a potential friend on Facebook, right? You saw them, they saw you. How do you address that next time you see that client? And again, I'm not saying you can't be on social media. What I'm saying is that you be prepared for the realities of inhabiting digital spaces alongside your clients, right? They're going to be online, you're going to be online, you're going to run into them, it's going to happen. How do you address that, right? How have you proactively addressed that? And then how are you going to continue to address that when the next time you see this client at your agency? So you also have to decide other kinds of professional and personal boundaries. So around your work-life balance, like what hours of the day are you willing to have your work email open, right? I would not recommend answering emails for work at midnight, right? I've certainly done it, but what are going to be your personal and professional boundaries, particularly, and I'm going to talk about Googling clients in a minute, and talking about clients online. So this should be obvious. Do not post, again, though you'd be surprised what social workers do not post identifying or confidential information about your clients online. That seems obvious. But even if you think you've anonymized them, right? Even if you think you've taken away the identifying or confidential information, I suggest not talking specifically about your clients, even if you think it's anonymized. I spend a lot of time in online social spaces specific to social workers and similar professions, and I can tell you it would be, even if they think they're totally anonymous, the case they're talking about is totally anonymous, it would be easy for me to figure out based on their other posts, the metadata of their posts, some of the techniques I have when it comes to technology, that I could probably figure out where they're practicing, even potentially who that client is, who they are, where they're practicing, who that client is. So just, it's safer not to, and if you're going to post potentially in a professional capacity about a particular case, you need to be very cautious and think through doing that. Again, it's not something you can't do, it's just something you have to be careful of doing. So this is a good resource. that I think will be helpful to many of you. So this is by NASW along with a number of other social work practice and education organizations in the US called Technology and Social Work Practice. It's new within the last 2 years and very practical. So some of you may be already familiar with this guide, and it's really a very useful resource. It is a US document, so some of the specifics, for example, around HIPAA may not be specifically relevant, but broadly speaking, a lot of the content is very relevant, and I'll show you some examples. So for example, this is their standard around social media policies and practice, which is that social workers who use social media shall develop a social media policy that they share with clients. So again, this is a good example of the kind of suggestion. Then they go through how they could interpret all the kinds of things you should include. And remembering, of course, when you think about your personal social media policy, you also need to be consistent with your organization's policy, if they have one. Some organizations do, some don't give you a lot of guidance. Now around Googling clients. So that's those same researchers who did those questions about clients Googling their providers, also asked providers about them looking for clients and found that half of mental health professionals have Googled their clients. Had sought out non-crisis, specifically, sought out non-crisis information. About another 28% had found that information accidentally, again, through those same networks where clients are accidentally seeing you. As a general rule, it's considered unethical to look your clients up online, unless under very specific circumstances and often with the client's consent. So there are good reasons to be looking up your client's content online, but there are a specific set of circumstances and your client should know it's happening, okay? Also, when thinking about your colleagues, so down here is around using search engines to locate information about your professional colleagues online. So you need to be really thoughtful about engaging with your colleagues online because they may be your friends, but they are also professional connections. Do you want your colleagues to be able to see your vacation photos or the photos you posted in high school or the content you wrote as a graduate student? And if so, that's okay, but you need to realize that that's what you're doing. So again, you just need to recognize and not avoid the situation or pretend you don't know. Another resource, which was recommended, thank you, that might be useful and some of you may also already have, is by Dr. Iris Jackson, who's the former president of the Ontario Psychological Association. So if you prefer the dead tree version of resources or the paper version of resources, the newest version of this book has, in the second chapter, has considerations for digital communication and has a sample digital communications policy. But even if you plug in social work communications policy into Google, things will come up that might be useful to you. And similarly, the guide from NASW, you'll probably find very helpful with that. So now I'm going to shift a bit into sort of the current and emerging opportunities of where technology is going. So this quote is actually from 2002, so what, 17 years ago now? Nearly anything a social worker does could theoretically be done online. Everything from case management, therapy, of course my text didn't print. I have a whole list of like a dozen different home visits, all of these different things, that areas of social work practice that are happening online. And technology really does have transformative potential for the discipline. So again, shifting back always to the code of ethics. These are some of the areas where we can look at opportunities for technology in practice, particularly in having and maintaining competence, promoting excellence in the profession, and advocating for change which is in the best interest of the client. And that part is key there. So a big part of that is digital literacy and social work. So we all know that cultural competency is important, right? We learned about that in our education. We know that in practice. Digital literacy or digital competence is just a new form of cultural competence. When our clients' lives are being mediated to such an extent through technology, that's an area of cultural competence where we need to understand the importance of technology to our clients, to their lives, to their lived experiences. So social workers increasingly have a responsibility to be competent in the use of technologies that are relevant to both their scope of practice and their clients' lives. This is basically what I just said. As more and more people engage in a technology-mediated world, we need to be aware of those technology-mediated relationships in our clients' lives. And again, of course, my notes didn't print properly. So essentially, this is particularly around assessment. So we don't ask, right? The vast majority of organizations, practitioners, we don't ask about how our clients use technology, how they mediate their lives with technology, and we're sort of often ignoring this sort of whole context in which they're living their everyday lives. And if we do ask, it's one or two really basic technology questions on an intake or assessment. So we need to be asking more questions. Ask. How do you use technology? How do you communicate with others? What are and are not comfortable with? What do you do when you go online, right? A lot of this, the types of questions you ask will depend on your client population. So things like demographics, the general use of technology in your client's population. It might depend on sort of the particular reasons they're working with you, but you need to be asking more questions. So one of the big areas that we're seeing a shift that's impacting practice is in the area of sort of smartphone apps and other similar kinds of online platforms. So 53% of patients in primary care reported using apps. And there exist, and this is of 2018, over 10,000 mental health and psychiatry smartphone apps in particular. That doesn't include the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of more general health and well-being apps, right? So anybody else in the room wearing a Fitbit or any of the other kinds of sort of general health, I'm sure we all have some of them on our phone, right? There are just an overwhelming number. And they can be used for a lot of different purposes. So some of you may be familiar with Mood Tools, which is a online app that sort of helps with mood tracking. It can sort of track behaviors, things like that. This is a sobriety tracker, so this is NOMO. A lot of them exist, but it's sort of in helping support someone who might have substance misuse concerns around tracking their substance misuse and or tracking as they shift away from using those substances. And this is an Ontario specific example as well, which is Be Safe, which is by Mind Your Mind, which is a digital safety planner for youth. So it provides them resources, helps them make decisions when they're experiencing crisis. So there are lots of different kinds of platforms. Medication apps are another, I use one every morning to remind me, right? There's lots of different kinds of these sort of health apps or health and mental health apps that we can see uses for in practice, right? So these kinds of apps can be used independently, right? A lot of us are just find them interesting and download them. Or they can be used as an adjunct, a specific adjunct to face-to-face or offline practice. And there are a lot of benefits to them, right? They're cost-effective. There's often a free or low-cost version. They're scalable. They're generally quite accessible now that the vast majority of us are walking around with smartphones. So even if we can't use them on our data plan, we can use them when we're on Wi-Fi. And they can fill treatment gaps or can bridge between treatment. And so you could develop a personalized therapeutic plan that incorporates these kinds of applications, that meets the specific needs of a particular client. It can provide really important and interesting opportunities for client self-management, for them to track their symptoms, and for treatment fidelity. So for example, sometimes we might ask a client to keep a journal. Well, they could do that on an app, right? Or again, a client struggling to keep with their medication regimen. So we could use a medication app, or it's a very complex regimen. So you can set it up so it'll remind them to take it, and then they can record that they took it so they remember. So there's all sorts of different things you can do. However, and this is a very big however, is there is very, very little information on the efficacy of these apps. And there's very little research and evaluation. So very few apps are developed by or with researchers and practitioners. Often, actually, a lot of the ones I see are someone who's been just a person who has the skills in app development, who's been personally impacted by a particular issue, and then developed an app for that issue. Or we see certainly for-profit companies developing apps as well. Interestingly, the first FDA-approved apps in the US have just been approved, one for substance use generally, it's a CBT app, and one for opioid use specifically, and they have just been approved by the FDA as a prescription app. So there are now prescription apps that insurance companies can pay for you to access in the United States, and I think we're very quickly going to see it here as well. But there are very significant concerns as well around regulation, a lack of data security. So you're telling your client, put all your medication history and when you should be taking all this personal health information into an app. Do you know where that information's going? Do you know what the developer's security procedures are? Do you know if they're compliant with Ontario and Canadian regulations or with the standards of the profession? If you don't, be very cautious in recommending them because you're telling a client to put all that information into an application and you don't know where that data is going. So shifting a bit, but I'm going to come back to this confidentiality concerns because it's huge in this area too, is around online counseling. So online counseling has a lot of different names, e-therapy, cyber counseling, online therapy. There's a lot of different names for it, but essentially, if you break it down into like a very simple definition, it's the use of technologies to provide therapy. So, and there are other types, but these are the main ones that you're most likely to see, is email-based communication or therapy, text chat therapy, video-based communication, and/or some combination of those previous three. So one, a lot of us are probably familiar with here in Toronto and in Ontario is Kids Help Phone, which has just in the last couple of years added text-based counseling, crisis counseling to their services. So there are two main types of online counseling. Okay, so there's what's called synchronous online counseling, where the communication between you and the client happens in real time. You're both present together. So that is the example like Kids Help Phone, texting back and forth, or video chat, right, where you're video chatting back and forth with your client. Then there is asynchronous online counseling, which is where there is a delay between the communication of you and the client. So that's often the email-based, where you send an email and you don't expect a response from your client, or you expect a response within 48 hours. They send it back to you. They would expect that you would respond within 48 or 72 hours. So it's more of like a passing a message back and forth process. So the research on online counseling, okay, indicates that it might be effective, because there is a growing body of research on online counseling specifically, in reducing symptoms and increasing functioning for many different kinds of mental health disorders. So depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, substance misuse, and with numerous different kinds of client populations, different demographics, age groups, things like that. And in multiple formats. So both that individual one-on-one, but also online group counseling is becoming a more significant practice as well. So the research indicates, and again, there's a decent amount of it now, but it is still emerging, that online counseling may be more suitable for some issues than others. Most of the research so far has been on psychoeducational or behavioral therapies, and other approaches either haven't been researched at all or have only very preliminarily been researched. So what you would need to do when you think about your client population that you might be interested in doing online counseling with, as well as your particular approach, you'd have to look and see whether there has been research done on that population or a similar one, and with a similar therapeutic approach. So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself as you start thinking about whether online counseling is for you. Is it suitable for the particular population of clients you're working with? So is it for the demographic that you're sort of generally thinking you might want to do it with? Is it appropriate for you? Do you want to be doing it, number one? And then do you have the digital literacy and technological skills? Have you had the training to be able to deliver online therapy? Because a lot of people think it's exactly the same, and it's, for those of you who have done it, it is not. It's a whole different skill set, and there are a lot of techniques that can help you provide very good counseling online, but you need to be trained in those techniques to be able to do them effectively. And then you also want to be thinking about your particular client, right? So what is your client's treatment history? What are their demographics again? Or what is their personal technological competence? Is this something they would be comfortable with and be actually able to do? And what are their treatment goals? And does online counseling make sense for that? So going in again to a lot of the potential benefits of online counseling. So it's really good at reducing structural barriers to service, right? So everything from the cost, it's often lower cost because there's lower overhead, but also other kinds of barriers to access. So maybe your client can't get to an office in normal business hours, but they can close the door to their office at lunchtime and do a session with you. Or the TTC, again, I grew up in the East End where it's extremely unreliable, where getting to services can take an hour, 2 hours, right? So can we cut off that transportation, cost, time, effort that creates a barrier? It can be more anonymous and can also, and because it's more anonymous or the clients feel a sense of distance, it can often increase their comfort and also increase their disinhibition. So they might be more comfortable talking about things that they're just not willing to walk into an agency and talk about, right? Now that has upsides and downsides, but it can, again, offer a way into service for people who otherwise would not be accessing it but do need it. That also, those asynchronous email approaches can also be really good because that time delay allows the client to reflect. It also allows you to be reflexive, right? So last summer when I did that course at U of T, I had a speaker come in who had been practicing text-based online counseling. And one of the things she liked most, because she was doing it in sort of the text-based equivalent of a call center, she really liked that because they were passing text messages back and forth and she knew she had a couple of minutes before a client would expect a response, because even though it's like instantaneous, there's still a delay as you're typing up your response, she could turn to the person next to her and do a clinical consultation or get some feedback or advice. Or she could go to her supervisor and say, I don't know how to handle this particular situation or how to respond, right? So that a space for sort of allowing for reflection on both the part of the client as well as the provider. And then for social workers and social service organizations, on a practical level, it reduced costs and overhead and time. And then, as I said, it also, you can reach out to new client populations and to new people who you otherwise would not be able to provide services to. There are, of course, a lot of challenges. As I spoke to, there is a real lack of context, right? So if you're passing emails back and forth, you lose body language and vocal cues and the larger sort of context in which you're delivering service. And again, there are techniques to address that. Some of you may be familiar with them, but you need to be trained in how to do that. Another big concern is around isolation of the client. If your client is already isolated, do you really want to be further isolating them by providing the services digitally rather than asking them to come into an agency and engage with you? For text, a lot of the text-based counseling formats, there are concerns about literacy issues. If a client can't express themselves fully in the text-based format, or they have difficulties with communication, particularly if, say, English is a second language and you only provide services in English, that can be a significant concern. And then technical difficulties. A lot of the online counseling platforms, the ones you should be using, and I'll talk about that in a minute, some of them are quite clunky, right? And they are difficult to use for you, but also particularly for the client who's less familiar with them. And then again, a lack of training or having to train in how to do this. And again, technical concerns are huge. And then there are something I've sort of grouped separately of ethics and client safety concerns. So one of the big ones, particularly in the non-video counseling, is how do you know who you're talking to? How do you know it's actually your client and their abuser hasn't taken control of their account, right? Or it isn't their friend who's hacked into their account? Or so how do you know it's them? So again, there are techniques to address this, but you have to be thinking about it. And then emergency situations. If your client communicates to you that that something's going on or they're in crisis, right? Like, do you have an emergency plan in place? Often the recommendation is to have an emergency